Hi, thanks for joining us on our fifth of our How to Win webinars. Format is exactly the same as the others. There's a lot of material on this one, so I'm going to cut the intro very, very short. This one is about structuring versus deep dive. How should you structure the content of your orals presentation? And we have three basic structures to talk through. And whilst that's quite a lot of information, I do want to see if I can cram this into 20 minutes so that we can still have time for a Q&A at the end. Obviously, format's exactly the same. I'll give you a presentation, and then there'll be a Q&A at the end, although we'll be lucky to do this in 15 minutes. If you have any questions, please tweet them. It's on an iPad over here, and I can look at them. If you're looking at the recording of this rather than watching it live, that's fine. Just tweet structure, not deep dive, in the question and send it to us. We will tweet a response to you. Okay, quick recap on a couple of things that we've learned in the previous webinars, because we're going to build on it. So you'll remember earlier we talked about the attention span of an audience and how it starts off quite low and then peaks and plateaus, and then around 20 minutes, once one person starts to switch off, the whole audience will switch off. And then we overlay on top of that the way we would structure an ideal sales pitch. And the ideal sales pitch is obviously a 3 to 4 minute intro, then the value proposition, which influences the IPD, has people thinking positively about the information flow. Then you prove your ability to deliver the value proposition, then you close before they all fall asleep, have the Q&A, and then close and hopefully get the order at the end. Okay, there's a whole webinar about that, but I wanted to recover it because we're going to refer back to this when we talk about how we actually structure the orals presentation, given three potential different scenarios that we get. You'll also remember that we pointed out again in I think the third webinar that this is a different construct to the way most people deliver their presentations. That most people deliver a presentation that's all about this is who we are and what we do, and has a slide at the end that says, oh, and by the way, here's the benefit of dealing with us. This one is all about what we have and what we do, and our structure here is more about what the client needs and what the client will benefit from. This switch from we to you is quite significant, and we'll talk about that in subsequent webinars to come. We also talked about what's in the box. So you remember the analogy as I tried to sell you a shoebox. Again, you can always watch this again if you want to. They're up on the website. But I try and sell people a shoebox for $100. I ask them, would you give me $100 for the box? And what happens is the first question that pops into their head is what's in the box? And what we say is we want to eliminate any distraction around them thinking about what's in the box, because they're ultimately not going to look at just one box, they're going to look at three. Now, I'm going to refer back to that because that what's in the box question is quite interesting. Sometimes a prospect cannot make a decision whether to buy something or not because they're worried about what's in the box. They have a burning question about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. They can't really think about the value and make a purchasing decision while they've got unresolved questions. And it's worth remembering that when we think about how should we structure an orals presentation. We're going to cover three scenarios. The first scenario is the client has allowed us to address the agenda. They've given us a time slot, usually an hour, sometimes it's a day, but more often than not in a complex bid process, they've given us an hour or 90 minutes or 2 hours in order to deliver a presentation with a Q&A at the end. We'll cover that briefly. How would we structure the presentation if we had no constraints from the client? More often than not, though, the client has come to us with an agenda, and that agenda then we often refer to as the exam question. You cannot win by not answering the exam question. However, you have to answer the exam question, and that's not enough to win. So what do? How do we answer the exam question but still make the case for why us rather than the competition? We'll talk about how you structure that. And then ideally, sometimes we get into a dialogue where we need to be interactive with the client. And in that case, how should we structure the information so that we can dive in and dive out and respond to their needs live, ask them the right questions to get them, to tell us which bits are making them worried. That's the ideal way of selling. And we'll give you a suggestion about how you would structure this. And we're going to show you effectively how do you construct your PowerPoint presentations so that you can cope with all three of these situations and reverse that into what you now know about sales structure and maybe what we know about the what's in the box analogy. So let's start with the ideal one. So the client has given us carte blanche, a time slot, come and present us on the 28th of March for 90 minutes. Tell us what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and why we should do it. So in this scenario, the ideal pitch is going to be obviously an introduction where we're probably going to, if not describe ourselves, who we are and what we do, we're probably going to describe the solution. This is what we're going to do for you in this specific incident. And we want to try and keep that, if we can, to those 3 to 4 minutes that fit over the IPD. Then we're going to have the value proposition. That value proposition, if you've been through a process with us, has to have 5 elements to it. It's possible to narrow or collapse all of those elements down usually to 1 or 2. We're going to save you money and increase your revenue or whatever it is. But actually, 2 things aren't enough to persuade people. So there's another webinar coming about how do you persuade people, and you really need 3, 4, or 5 reasons that are compelling to get people to buy. So we predominantly pick 5 reasons for choosing us. It gives us 5 reasons for doing something, and if they don't believe them all, they can buy them. Then the idea is we use that graphic to segue. Now, segues are not a word that's in common usage. I don't mean the little thing with wheels on that you whiz around the city in. A segue is a smooth transition from one thing to another, from one subject to another subject. And so we use the graphic, the value proposition graphic, to segue the presentation into 5 chunks. And each of those chunks is then going to have a set of slides that proves our ability to deliver that value proposition. And again, we have another webinars where we talk about what proof looks like, and proof falls into one of these 5 categories that we like to call pilot. It's either a process, or it's IP, or it's logical, or it's an operational proof, or it's a testimonial proof. And we're picking the right combination of these because don't normally just use one. So that might be, a bit of a process, a bit of a logical argument, wrapped up with a quote from a client saying that we're able to deliver it. That's the sequence of slides that follows the segue that says, here's the value proposition, now let's prove it. Then you would do the same for each of the 5, and you would clock around that wheel doing 5 individual sections of the presentation. And each section of the presentation is based on pilot, so that you're proving your ability to deliver it. Once you've done that, it's the main body of the presentation, then we're going to go back to recapping the value proposition, which is when you close. Hopefully you get the Q&A. So we flesh out all the problems, have the Q&A, and then, if they've got all of their problems out and they've given you all of their objections, you should be able to isolate and close the deal. Just a quick point, if you are bidding a complex deal, we would like you to be last, not first. And last because you can actually ask the client to make a decision. They might not tell you about making the decision because they're in the middle of a process and they're not supposed to, but they are able to think about the answer. And for you to say, so are you happy going with us, or are you in a position to give us a decision? Can we have the business? Right at the very end, they will actually think about it. More often than not, their body language gives it away. And then once they're committed, they're committed. So always try and go last if you can, so that you can actually close and ask for the business. Right, so let's look at here's the whole structure: introduction, value proposition, the 5 individual sections, and wrap up the end with the Q&A. Let's map that over the attention span, so that you're crystal clear about how it happens. We've got an introduction, which describes what we're going to sell them and who we are. That's only going to last 4 or 5 minutes. Then the value proposition, and then each of those 5 sections, one after each another, wrapping up with the value proposition, and then having the Q&A. And often we'll leave the value proposition on the screen whilst we have the Q&A, because then there's a whole webinar coming about how do you handle the Q&A. You tie it back to the value proposition so that you get more repetition and more continuity into the presentation. Right, that's the ideal sales pitch. Now, what happens if they come and say, okay, we've got 15 questions for you, right? We want you to answer these 15 questions, or maybe they're 15 sections. Tell us about the transition, tell us about the solution, tell us about the technology, tell us about the people, tell us about the HR, whatever it is. They'll have given you topics that you need to present on. How do you do that? How do you present the answer? Remember, this is now what's in the box. By definition, they're asking you a load of questions about what's in the box, and we don't want to answer that ideally, because we won't differentiate ourselves and won't sell something by answering questions about what's in the box. So what we have to do is constantly think about lifting the lid, answering the questions, putting the lid back on, and reminding them about the value of our box versus somebody else's. So this is the way this structure works. Again, we'll do an introduction where we're going to describe, largely the solution. This is what we're going to do at a 60,000 foot level. Maybe this is who we are and what we do if you've got some credibility issues, but we want a nice tight description to take it off the table so they understand what it is you're actually going to do, at a broad level. Then we're going to put the value proposition in and talk about, well, why would you choose us? Now, sometimes, just a caveat, sometimes we have to have two value propositions. One is, here is the reason for doing the project. And then secondly, here is the reason for doing it with us rather than somebody else. Sometimes we blend those two. So sometimes we'll have 5 spokes of value proposition. 2 of those are a reason for doing the project. 3 are the reason for doing the project with us. There's some finessing around the complexity of the arguments to get this right. But that has to be the second section, because that's when you're going to get people in that IPD deciding whether to be positive or negative about the information flow. Assuming we've done that, this is a 90-second elevator pitch that says this is what's important to you. Then we take their exam question, whatever their exam question might be. In this one, how does your process help employee health and satisfaction? And that's a typical question that somebody might ask in an HR process or in a purchasing process. You have to answer that question. So what we would suggest is, what we help clients do, answer the question, figure out what slides you need in order to tell that story, and then when you finish telling the story, put up the value proposition wheel and highlight the subset of those that this supports. And what you're doing is, effectively, we've taken the lid off the box here. We're answering the questions for the client. This is what's in the box. This is what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. But then we are metaphorically putting the lid on the box and saying, well, by the way, our box is better than their box because of these. And we're getting some repetition in and we're tying it back to, and the benefit of this to you is at the end of each section. Then you take, the next whatever questions they've given you, you give whatever these presentations have to be to answer the question, and each one is tied back. Now, so the presentation we've picked here is a best doctor's presentation. When this is the whole thing is only going to last 20 minutes. Maybe this lasts 2 days. The longest one we've done is a 3-day presentation for HP to Aviva, over 3 days, 36 different presentations, but every single presentation, which was an hour long, always had the last slide was the value proposition, and we tied it back so that they got the consistent message over the 2 days. So it doesn't actually matter whether this is a condensed 20-minute presentation, answer 5 questions, or an extrapolated 2-day engagement where they're going to ask lots of different scenarios. Each time you wrap it up with tying it back to the value proposition. And you see what we've tried to do here, and we thought about it, is we're trying to make these value propositions relevant to the question. We are making sure that we get repetition of all of them in a couple of times, so that by the time they get to the end of whatever the presentation duration is, they have heard the individual "this is why you choose us" messages repeated 2, 3, 4, or 5 times throughout the day or the presentation, so that they start to learn it and they start to unconsciously be able to articulate the reason for choosing you rather than lose the competition. Then we would summarize at the end, having had the Q&A, right, the value proposition. Then we're going to close. That might then generate some more value propositions, so we'd summarize again, and then same structure at the end. That's how we would do that. Now, typically, this isn't going to be over a 20-minute presentation, right? If they've asked multiple questions, you're going to find that you're going to extend beyond that 20-minute attention span. So what we might need to do is think about how we back on different attention spans. We generally recommend that you should break every 3. You can do 2 soft breaks, break people's attention, bring it back. You can do that twice, but the 3rd time you really need to have a hard break. You really need to get them up, get them moving, have them go to the toilet, check their emails, do whatever. So the hard break usually comes in after 2 soft breaks. Soft breaks are, change of pace, change of presenter, allow them, a couple of seconds, tell a joke or an anecdote, allow the attention to wander off and bring it back. Now, we baked into that is at the end of each of these questions, we've got the value proposition repeated, gives us an opportunity to change subject matter, change pace, break their attention and bring it back. That's what allows us to do this. But what we're doing is making sure that we get all the way to the end before they fall asleep. And at 90 minutes, give or take, that's where we want to be planning to be at the end of the presentation for them. So that's how we respond when we've been given a specific question. What do we do when we're told, come along, we'll ask you a load of questions, you respond? So no set agenda, but I don't want you to give a presentation to me, I want you to come and respond to a Q&A. Well, then we're into this world of having to be interactive, having to react on the fly to questions that we might get. We still want to get the value proposition in, and we still want to get the repetition of those value propositions in. So how do we prepare the material to allow the sales team to fluidly move between answering the client's questions and responding in an appropriate sales way by putting the lid on the box? And the solution is to, once again, do the intro, then do the value proposition to set it up, but then to take the value proposition and add to it hyperlinks on each one of these buttons that says we could go anywhere. And you would effectively say to the prospect or the client, like, each one of these is a button, it's hot, we can go down whichever one, which one is keeping you awake at night. And when the person says, well, I'm really interested in eliminating medical errors because litigation is costing me a lot of money, well, you can click on that one, and then that will give you access to that run. And once you finish that run, it brings you back to the value proposition to allow you to cover it. And then you can go down another one if you need to. Let's just go back. So you could go down a second one, a third one. You don't have to go through all 5 each time. The PowerPoint's got a home button, which will bring you back to this one slide so that you can ask the questions. And the interesting thing here is, if you get this right, because you're asking the client which bits are worrying them, you're getting some insight into where their pain points are. The most pressing issue for this person was reducing the medical errors. The second one then was improving the experience. So we know that we might think that actually the improved clinical outcomes is the most important. But what the client is telling us by his choice is that actually, eliminating getting sued is far more important than actually improving the outcome of his general population. Interesting insight into their psychology, also an interesting insight into whether or not we're going to be able to sell to them using all 5, or whether we're going to take a subset of these. You often find they're not interested in one section, which is great. You don't need to present it. You can close once they've said they've got no more questions about it. So the way this functions then is you've got exactly the same structure. We go through the value proposition, close, Q&A at the end, and then ask for the order. But fundamentally, we're trying to map that over the audience's attention. This works really, really well if there's a small number of people in the room. If you've got 100 people in the room, right, and it gets interactive, then you've got a problem, because not everybody is interested in the same thing, and so it gets harder to manage. But on a small scale, with 3 or 4 people in the room, you're going to do your intro, then you're going to put the value proposition, ask them what they're interested in. You're going to do each of these sections, and then you're going to make sure that you soft break where you need to when their attention is wandering, a hard break if you have to, and then summarize before you go in, before you close and ask for the order. Okay, 3 different scenarios that may show you, 3 different ways of using broadly the same material, but using it differently given the situation. Whether it's an ideal sales pitch, they've asked you a load of questions, or they've just asked you to come and have a chat to them. What we're trying to do is take what we know about attention span and structuring the information flow in the right way so that your salespeople are aware when they've got the lid on the box and when they've got the lid off the box. Now, we'll talk in a later webinar about what you do when you get asked a question, because actually when you're in the box or out the box, your response to those questions are different. When you're in the box, you should respond to a question and answer it. If you've out the box and got the lid on, you should respond with a probing question back to see if you can close. And one of the things we often do is color code the material so that the slides where they're selling and they're out of the box are a completely different contrasted color to the ones that when they're in the box. And what that does is it's a tool to help the bid response team or the sales team to respond appropriately to a question, because when they're asked a question, look at the screen. And if the screen is white, they're teaching, answer the question. If it's dark, they're selling, ask a question back, try and close. And that works really well. Okay, so that's this one. Coming up next week, in a fortnight's time, if you're still around, you're still interested, we're going to be talking about what happens when you have to do a technical demo of a software or a machine or some kind of product. How do you avoid getting dragged into the minutiae and the detail, which doesn't sell, and how do you keep it at such a level where you can actually make the case for selling? So really, it's about making sure that we're demonstrating value, not functionality, and we're going to show you some screen grabs from an online tool that we've helped people develop sales tools for, and talk about how you might be able to finesse that for whatever it is you sell, so that you understand you're addressing the right balance between here's the training course that teaches you how to use it, which you get after you've bought it, and here's the reason why you should buy it in the first place.